Today, we're going to talk philosophy. In particular, we're going to talk epistemology or philosophy of knowledge, and we're going to talk about the question of solipsism. So the title of the video, what if you are the only thing that exists on talking to a solipsist? First of all, let's define solipsism. Solipsism is the view that you are the only thing that exists, or I am the only thing that exists. Now, how should we think about solipsism? The first way we want to think about it is that solipsism is a skeptical challenge to knowledge. It's like the evil demon or the brain in a vat or the Matrix. So, for example, how do you know that you actually are perceiving a world external to yourself? Because it seems possible that you could just be deceived by an evil demon into thinking there is an external world around you. How do you know that you are not a brain in a vat? Because it's possible, for all we know, that you could in fact just be a brain in a vat that's being stimulated with sensory data to make you think there is an external world to your brain. You could be in the Matrix, again, and locked up into a computer, like the brain in a vat, being stimulated by sensory data that is not in fact corresponding to any objective external reality. Along similar lines, but really even in a more extreme direction, is the challenge of the solipsist. How do you know that you are not the only thing at all? Because it seems possible that in fact, the singular individual's mind simply generates all of their conscious experience, including all the other minds they perceive or people they perceive, the external world around them. All of that is simply a product of the individual's mind. So solipsism is, first of all, an epistemological challenge or a skeptical challenge to knowledge. Second, in rare circumstances, it can also be an existential challenge. That happens when you meet somebody who actually finds themselves persuaded or perhaps tempted by the lure of solipsism. I've recently had this experience, not myself, but rather somebody has contacted me online who is experiencing the lure of solipsism and asking me for arguments against solipsism. For the sake of our conversation, I'm going to refer to this person as Solo. Clever, right? So Solo contacted me a few months ago, and I wrote an article in response to Solo with their permission, which I posted online, where I sought to address some of their arguments for solipsism. And they found that relatively compelling, I guess. But they contacted me more recently and still find themselves drawn to the lure of solipsism. So I want to take on that question in this video. Now, first of all, you might be thinking, isn't this whole thing self-defeating? If you are asking somebody else for arguments to defeat solipsism, aren't you thereby implicitly conceding that another person exists and thereby defeating solipsism? And I think that that's a reasonable interpretation. I think, however, that a solipsist could come back and say, well, possibly, but if solipsism is true, then the other person I'm simply talking to by email or what have you is in fact simply an object of my consciousness. It's just a process of my own ratiocination, reflection, in terms of I'm trying to explore whether I could disprove that which is in fact true, i.e. solipsism. So I don't think the fact that Solo has contacted me asking for arguments against solipsism is in and of itself a defeater of solipsism. The next thing I want to just consider is this question, which might come to mind for you. Isn't this whole conversation kind of crazy? Right? Asking whether I am the only thing that exists. Why should we even take that seriously? However, I do think we should take it seriously because the nature of philosophical questions, serious philosophical questions, the very best philosophical questions, are that they challenge our assumptions about reality. There is perhaps no philosophical question more basic than this one. Why is there something rather than nothing? That is a profound question. And it's a question that many people go through their entire lives and they never pause to reflect on that question. Philosophy challenges us to pause, to move aside, step aside, or out of the warp and woof of daily life and to ask fundamental questions such as, why is there something rather than nothing? Or what if I'm the only thing that exists? How would I know that I'm not the only thing that exists? So I think we should take the question of Solo seriously. And the next thing I want to note is that there's no magisterial refutation of solipsism, at least none that I can see. So rather than look for an argument that is in the level of a logical proof to establish beyond any doubt that solipsism is false, I think that we should set our sights lower, and then perhaps we won't be disappointed. Let's simply look at good reasons to think that solipsism is false, and thus that we should set aside the existential lure and not be kept up at night by the skeptical possibility of solipsism. With that in mind, let's turn to Solo and Solo's arguments for solipsism. The gist of Solo's arguments are interesting, but I think relatively undeveloped. But like with so many things, arguments that may appeal to one person may not appeal to another person, just like music or clothing or something else. It doesn't necessarily mean the argument's a bad argument. Some people find an argument persuasive, others not. And there's almost always a significant degree of subjectivity when each one of us is assessing or evaluating the quality of arguments. So I'm not compelled by Solo's arguments. I don't find them to be very strong at all. Solo differs at this point. Doesn't mean I'm automatically right and Solo's wrong, right? We can just disagree on that. But here is the argument, the gist of the argument that Solo gives. Solo has noticed over months, perhaps years, that Solo has, that often when Solo thinks about something, shortly afterward, that thing comes to be. In other words, Solo thinks about a particular individual they haven't seen for a while, and 5 minutes later, that individual appears out of nowhere. And, oh, hey, Dave, I was just thinking about you, that kind of thing. And Solo has noticed that this happens a lot. And Solo has reasoned from that perhaps I am, in fact, the one creating this external reality, this flow of conscious experience, that I then think that I'm just one subject of experience in the midst of. But in fact, maybe I'm creating all of it. So that's the kind of argument that Solo is appealing to. Like I said, I'm not particularly compelled by that kind of evidence, but Solo is. So let's go from there. First thing then that we want to talk about is how should we label or think about this data that Solo is talking about? And the phenomenon is commonly called synchronicity. Synchronicity, I think, is best sort of defined in terms of ostensive definition. In other words, giving examples of synchronicity, because people tend to notice when they've experienced synchronicity. Here's an example, a couple examples that I've had of synchronicity. So one of them, I was sitting down to have the last piece of sponge cake from the fridge. And so I put it down on the table and the radio was playing in the background. And I wasn't really listening to the radio at the time. But as the radio song started to play, I put the plate down on the counter, got my fork, and was just about to dig in the fork when I suddenly realized that the song playing was Jimmy Buffett, Margaritaville, which begins, living on sponge cake. In that moment, I had a fork full of sponge cake on the way to my mouth, and he sings on the radio, living on sponge cake. Now that's synchronicity. Here's a second example of synchronicity that I experienced. I was, some years ago, I was at home and playing one of these TV radio stations, and this was a jazz channel on our cable package. So it's playing like mid 20th century jazz. And then suddenly it plays a completely unusual song that does not fit into the format. It is the song Birmingham by Canadian artist Amanda Marshall, which is kind of like a rock song. It's not a mid 20th century jazz diva song. It totally stood out from the platform, from the music they were playing. And so that caught my attention. I thought, why are they playing Birmingham on this jazz station? And I was reading a book at the time. Then I turned the page to go to the next chapter. It was a collection of writings from the 20th century civil rights movement. And you know what the next chapter was? Martin Luther King Jr., letter from Birmingham jail. That's synchronicity. That's when synchronos, at the same time, events happen. In other words, events occur in a suggestive, seemingly meaningful way, out of the random, in a way that captures your attention and leads you to think there's something significant about what just happened. There's something going on here. That is synchronicity. And so what Solo has experienced is synchronicity, that Solo will think of a particular individual and moments later they pop up. Hey, oh, how are you doing? And things like that happen a lot for Solo, and Solo's taken notice of it and thus has reason to solipsism from synchronicity. Now, there's a pretty quick and obvious refutation that probably many of us are thinking of here. You may not know the term Littlewoods Law, but you know the basic idea. The basic idea is just to say things like that are not actually meaningful. They're not significant. It's simply chance. Because if you wait long enough, chance events will inevitably occur. According to Littlewoods Law, approximately once a month, a 1 in a million chance will happen to a person, something really out of the ordinary that is seemingly meaningful and significant, but is simply the product of the fact that the sheer number of events we experience every day, there are bound to be times when the food that we are about to eat just happens to correspond with the music on the radio, things like that. So synchronicity is going to happen. It doesn't make it meaningful, doesn't mean that you're the only person in the universe. It's simply chance. Personally, I would find Littlewoods Law to be probably a pretty good refutation, if not a compelling refutation, of thinking that there is anything more at stake in what Solo is experiencing. Having said that, I have not experienced all of Solo's experiences of seeming to anticipate events. So I want to leave it open that had I had Solo's experiences, I might think differently. So with that in mind, let me consider another scenario. And this is the scenario that I pitched to Solo. I said, it's also possible that not that Solipsism is true, but rather that you are clairvoyant. Clairvoyance is the ability to perceive events either in the past or events that have not yet occurred, which are in the future, which would be otherwise beyond any kind of normal sensory contact. So a person who would be clairvoyant would be a person who could perceive the future, could see things that are about to happen. So I said, look, it's possible. I mean, I may find Littlewoods Law sufficient to say this is just chance. These events of synchronicity are not evidence of something more. But if there is to be something more, I suggest you think about something like clairvoyance, that you have an ability perhaps to perceive events before they occur, rather than to think that you are the only person that exists. Now, here's a big question at this point. We're two roads divided in the woods, right? And which road are we going to take? The road to solipsism or the road to a more mundane explanation like clairvoyance, assuming that we're not going to consider Littlewoods Law. Why take the road of clairvoyance rather than the road of solipsism? The reason is common sense realism. I am a common sense realist. And because I'm a common sense realist, I'm going to go with clairvoyance, or frankly, Littlewoods Law. But if I have to consider something beyond the ordinary, I will reasonably perhaps go with something like clairvoyance. Okay, but what is common sense realism? Let me put it like this. Common sense realism would say that all things being equal, we should prefer explanations for a phenomena that are consonant with our basic understanding of reality that we accept or that people commonly accept. Try to maximize, in other words, the way the world seems to you, rather than to just steamroll the way the world seems to you by adopting completely extraordinary explanations. Now, we have to be careful because people are going to offer, I think, what is ultimately a failed rebuttal of a common sense realism. What people will often do is they will say, yeah, but what about this? What about this? For example, well, common sense realism would say the earth is flat, right? People commonly assume the earth is flat, but we clearly know that the earth is not flat. Here's a little bit more of a sophisticated one, perhaps. People commonly assume that colors are in objects, but in fact, colors are not in objects. Colors are in our minds. Colors are the sensory perceptual experiences, or the qualia, that we undergo as conscious perceivers when we interact with objects in a three-dimensional environment. You could say that colors are, in a sense, objective insofar as we say we reduce them to a dispositional property within the object, which can produce a phenomenal experience within the perceiver. So, for example, I could say the apple is not actually red, but the apple has a dispositional property that produces the experience of seeing red in individuals who perceive the apple. But the apple is not red, and so common sense realism fails again. The thing is, those are not objections to common sense realism, because common sense realism is not committed to infallibilism. In other words, it's not saying we can never fail when we follow common sense. It only says that common sense is the best starting point for processing phenomena, understanding phenomena, seeking to understand the world around us. And so if we can prefer common sense explanations, we ought to. If it turns out that there's evidence for the Earth being a sphere or an oblate spheroid, well, then we ought to abandon common sense that told us initially the Earth was flat. If we come up with a good philosophical argument from George Berkeley or John Locke that says colors are in fact not in the objects we perceive, but rather in the perceiver, well, then we ought to perhaps abandon common sense there as well. But that doesn't defeat common sense realism. It simply reminds us that we are fallible creatures and can make mistakes. And so it is here. My claim is not that I can defeat solipsism. My claim, rather, is that we have a far better, simpler explanation for the experience of synchronicity, one which maximizes our adherence to common sense realist principles. And that is to say, not that I'm the only thing that exists, but rather to say that I have perhaps the ability to sensory perceive events that have not yet occurred. And so when I'm about to see somebody I know, that person's image pops into my mind, I think of them, and then I see them moments later. All that requires is that I have this additional ability, a sense perceptual ability of clairvoyance that I did not know existed before. But it still allows there to be other people and an external world. And that is in contrast to solipsism, which utterly steamrolls common sense by saying, I am the only thing that exists. So I think that solipsism, in other words, is a radically unjustified rejection of the deliverances of common sense. And if you are, like me, compelled by the lure of maintaining a conservative common sense realism where you accept things as they seem to be unless you have some overriding reason to adopt another explanation, well, then you ought to continue to believe that there are external people out there and there is an external world apart from your mind, even if you do experience things like synchronicity, which you might be compelled to explain by way of clairvoyance.